Okay, good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Tuesday, January 24th at 9:07 in the morning. We will begin our morning with looking at the Budget Adjustment Act and specifically Section 1 and Section 7. Before we get there, I just want to be sure, committee, hopefully you had a good weekend, I hope. Hope you get recharged and ready to go this week. Also, is everyone familiar or does everyone understand what we're looking at today as far as the Budget Adjustment Act? Everyone comfortable? Do they have questions on what it is, what we're...
Yeah, we just want to make sure that everyone understands what this whole process is all about. And if there's any questions, just feel free, but need to ask, okay?
Okay, so I think we'll begin. We have Doug Farnham, the Deputy Secretary of the Agency Administration. We also have Kendall Smith with us, the Director of Policy Development, Legislative Affairs in the Governor's Office. And so we've asked them to come in and go over Section 1 and Section 7 to begin with. This is dealing with the $3 million to help implement the Rural Infrastructure Assistance Program that's being proposed in budget adjustments, so that we have a better idea of what that entails and the thoughts there. So Kendall, Doug, good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate your time and look forward to hearing about this program to help our rural communities.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Kendall Smith. I'm Governor Scott's Director of Policy Development and Legislative Affairs. Andrew, I'm pulling up the Zoom link so that I can share my screen here in a few minutes. But before I do that, I just want to say I'm very excited to be here with you all in this physical room today. This room feels like my home committee room. Prior to being in the governor's office, I spent a lot of time in here on these benches. And so I was very excited to get to come in here today and come back to my old stomping ground. Anyway, so like the chair said, we're here to speak with you today about one of the initiatives that the governor has in his budget adjustment, which is currently being contemplated by you all and upstairs in House Appropriations. And the section deals with the $3 million that the governor is proposing to help more rural underserved communities better access the infrastructure programs that the governor and the legislature have invested in over the past couple of years. And when I say infrastructure, I'm talking sticks and bricks in this instance. Obviously, there are other types of infrastructure that are more service-based, but right now we're talking about tangible buildings and sewer systems and things of that nature. So I think we've been talking a lot about this in the building. Maybe you all know a little bit about it or heard a little bit about it to date. But we're sensing that everyone agrees there's a real urgency to do this. And Doug and I can get into the details about what this is here as we go through it. But right now, again, over the past few years, there's been a significant amount of money invested into water and sewer projects, housing, economic recovery, so capital investments for buildings, broadband, and did I already say housing? And housing, if I didn't. Within the kind of economic recovery, those are kind of 5 buckets for ARPA, but we've also put some general fund money into things like brownfield remediation. And you heard the governor talk about another proposed investment for the big budget coming up in that space. And we've been tracking how communities are doing accessing those funds. We've been looking at where applications coming from. And in a second, I'm going to put some data on the screen here. Who's applying, who's being awarded funds. Before any money goes out, we're striving as an administration to do kind of a collaboration and deconfliction process. So I'm going to use an example. The Agency of Natural Resources is going to put out village water and sewer or wastewater grants. We send that list around to all the other agencies and departments that have infrastructure money and say, here's where water and sewer is going. Does this either conflict with anything else anyone was going to do, or how can we better collaborate? Because we don't want to pave a road that we're gonna have to rip up in 3 years to put down broadband or to do something else with water sewer, let's say. Or, hey, Agency of Commerce, here's where we're gonna have more wastewater capacity on this timeline, so maybe keep this in mind for housing, or if we get economic recovery applications, et cetera. But what we're seeing as we're doing this kind of really intense tracking of where money is going is that it's being concentrated in the areas that you may expect that have full-time municipal staff, more support services in their communities. So we're seeing a lot of the money going to kind of that northwest corridor of Vermont between Franklin County and Montpelier, frankly, on that part of the I-89 corridor. And we're seeing less money being granted out in, especially you can kind of guess, Essex, Orleans, Grand Isle, Orange, certain parts of southern Vermont. Some of the data I'm going to show in a minute is really high level by county, but obviously we know within counties there can be a difference where there are more well-situated towns and then towns that are struggling. So I just want to recognize that. But some of the easier way to visualize how it's going is by county. So again, I'll put that up here in a moment and Doug will walk through it. And so what the governor is trying to do in the budget adjustment is to make sure that every community in Vermont that wants it has access to these infrastructure programs. We've been going out on the road to counties where we've been seeing those applications coming from, trying to do some prospecting, trying to do some education, and the feedback's been really good. And what we were hearing from communities, we were just in Orange County yesterday, we were in Essex and Orleans earlier this fall, is feedback from the folks that are turning out saying, you know, this is great and I want to take advantage of it, but we don't have somebody that's working full-time and is able to comb the state website every day looking for grant opportunities. We don't have a grant writer. If we were to be granted funds, project management is really hard and we need more assistance with that. And we do have an interest, but it just takes us longer to organize and to pull, again, what's required to get the funds because they're competitive grant competitions, again, compared to some of the communities that have more resources and more resources, staff, et cetera, at their disposal. So we don't feel like this is a new program. We feel like this is technical assistance. We feel like the legislature and the administration already made the policy decision to put money into these infrastructure buckets. And what we're trying to do right now through this is make sure, again, like I said, everybody has access to these funds should they want it. It's not meant to be a brand new program. It's meant to be a short-term stopgap because the federal monies have a timeline on them for when they need to be obligated and expended that Doug can walk through in a little bit more detail before they'll be clawed back. We want to continue to try to get ahead of spring and summer construction season. So again, I want to be clear, we don't view this as a long-term rural capacity initiative. It's, again, a short-term technical assistance stopgap for infrastructure projects that we have already agreed we want to invest in as a state. So where I'm going to leave it, hold on. If I hit join with computer audio, am I going to create an extreme echo?
Yes. Yeah, join without audio.
Join.
Join,
Just hit-
continue, sorry.
Join with, just hit continue?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Got it.
Thanks. And then if I wanted to share screen. So. So to visualize what I was just describing, this is a slide that our director of racial equity uses a lot, and it describes equality versus equity. So right now, if you envision kind of the grant process, either through state requirements or federal requirements as the fence, right now our competitive grant process that we set out as a state has everybody in the equality side of this picture, where we're like, you know, it's a competitive grant process. You all just need to do the same thing and apply. What we're trying to do is create equity so everybody has the tools that they need to apply over on the right. And those tools are going to look different to different communities, different businesses, different areas of the state.
Kendall, before we continue on.
Yep.
I know last year in the budget, we also put money in there to VLCT and the RPCs for technical assistance. And
Yep.
so I think probably one of the questions is apparently that money wasn't enough. And we have both of them coming in.
Great.
We want to understand better, you know, what did that money do for us or for the communities? And the other question I'm getting from appropriations is why do we need now to add more money?
Got it. So it's a great question because yes, there was funds sent to BLCT and RPCs to kind of help shepherd communities through these processes. And we've had a great partnership with them. Doug works really closely with BLCT. We've been speaking with the RPCs quite a bit over the past few weeks. And they will likely, obviously I cannot speak on behalf of them, will share with you what we're trying to do, what the administration is trying to do with this money is a little bit more than they're able to do in terms of really looking at, let's say, 3 towns as your client and like hand holding those specific 3 towns, like from start to end through a process. I think that they're still good partners and they're still really important to what we're trying to do. We just need more. Like, again, just because there's a timeline on these funds to get them out, we just need more. And some communities just need more assistance with organizing.
And excuse me for 1 second, but
Sorry, I'm late.
so I know last year, the monies that we were, for this year's budget, we ARPA dollars that we were using to provide that technical assistance. Now, I think this is general fund dollars that's being proposed, and is there a reason why we want to go with general fund dollars opposed to using the money that's already there in ARPA to?
So the legislature's already, you've already appropriated all the ARPA money. If we were going to use ARPA money, we'd have to claw it out of a program. We'd have to go back and we'd have to subtract it from a housing program or a water sewer program. There's no available ARPA money unless, again, we're going to take it away from infrastructure for us to use right now. Anything you'd report there?
A couple technical things to add there. The VLCT money, if I remember right, is somewhere around like 800,000 or somewhere in that range. And it was for very high level technical support for the entire period of ARPA. So it's for a small number of staff to provide high level support for like 4 years. And they've been extremely instrumental in distributing high level information. It's been a great support. It was an excellent addition. The RPCs, I think, was around 2 million, and it was general resources. So the biggest difference there is that there's no focus on that money. They get that money to provide technical support to any of the towns that they work in, whether that town is really mature in their planning and development processes or whether they need a lot more help. And RPCs are faced with tough decisions every day of who do they help and what order do they help people in. So that generalization is probably the biggest difference here. The other reason not to use ARPA at this point in Vermont's path is that ARPA is the focus. ARPA is the catalyst for this proposal, but it's possible some of these projects that are developed could be partially funded with ARPA and then partially funded with other federal sources like the Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act or the Inflation Reduction Act or the Omnibus package has a lot of federal money flowing around with some opportunities for municipalities. Using general fund lets us help them get ready for those other programs as well. We do want to maximize their opportunity for ARPA, but if we use ARPA funds, it has to stay focused with kind of blinders on. If we use general fund, we can help them prepare for longer term planning. And if they don't make it in time for state money, for the state appropriations of ARPA money, then we can still help them be in a much better position for the IIJA and IRA and omnibus packages.
So there's less strings attached to general fund dollars so that we can help.
More flexibility.
Right.
Yep. Nice
I'll get that
papers.
for you.
Thank you, Reb. So I'm going to turn it over.
I got a couple more questions.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, Kendall, so my question is, if I would just sort of think about my town and my regions, I'm sure that the towns who have their administrators in place have been reaching out to VLCT and to the RDCs. Will there be some analysis done on who hasn't? If I don't know who's exactly gonna, because we don't know where this money's going, but like, you know, my fear is that yet still the towns with a part-time town clerk only will still feel a little bit like
So
I don't have time.
Yeah.
I have a volunteer select board.
Right.
I'm doing everything I possibly can do to keep, you know, I'm maintaining my job and doing
So-
my job, but I don't have more time. So who's going to do the reaching out? Because I think it needs to come from the RDCs or VLCT or wherever, to reach out to the towns to really find out who need, and some handholding and some like really in-depth discussions.
yes, so that's the plan. can we address, so when we get into that part, when we're talking about more of the granular specifics, the plan is that we would require and work with VLCT, AOA, the RDCs, to do direct outreach to a set of priority communities. They would have to do that. They'd have to approach them and say, these resources are available to you. Here's how you can access them. We'll talk about a retainer list in a second here with where basically there'd be another entity that's able to take on a lot of the work for the community. But I hear you that, right, we're saying the problem is it's a competitive grant program. People don't know about it. People don't have time. So what we really want to affect with this is that direct engagement and that direct connection. Like, we're coming to tell you what's available to you and make it easy for you to access. So if we can, we'll jump into that a little bit more when we're walking through the mechanics, if that's okay, Rep. Jerome.
Yeah, sounds good.
John?
Sorry, I know you want to get on with your presentation, but this seems, speaking as a former town administrator, this seems slightly backwards to me in that, imagine there's a dam and that's where all the ARPA dollars are, that's where all the competitive dollars are. And rather than, and the dam is breaking, rather than fixing the dam, we're going to the municipalities and we're saying, here's some sandbags. Why true equity would be reforming the actual grant programs themselves rather than providing the technical assistance to access those monies. I'm curious if the administration has put any thought to that.
Definitely. That's a great point, great question. And if you scroll back up to the equity picture.
Yes.
So there are layers in many of these programs, right? So the box we can control. So this is intended to be the second box, this rural assistance fund. The fence, picture two fences in front of them. One is the federal fence, which we have no control over. So many of these dollars are federal dollars and we have to do certain things. We have to help them comply. So we can't lower or remove that fence. There is a state fence, which could be lowered or removed, which has been tried for every year since I've been a state employee. And it's been very difficult to, reach agreement on how to lower that fence, how to streamline things for towns. So I do think you're right. There's a medium and long-term discussion that goes along with this. But the reason we're proposing a short-term solution right now, and it's proposed to be run out of AOA, which should never, in my opinion, run long-term programs. Because that is not the role, that is not the statutory purpose of AOA. But in this one situation, AOA has performed an oversight and coordination role for the federal pandemic funds. And that's why we're proposing it to be seated here. I also have insight into every pandemic program. I oversaw the creation of 250 plus programs. I know how they fit together. I can help the towns because I've got most of it in my head. And I also used to be the director of property valuation and review. So I'm used to approaching towns and talking to them with respect and trying to start a conversation there. So there would be direct engagement from the RPCs, RDCs, VLCT. I also plan to go out and visit some towns and say, we want to provide you assistance with the lowest barriers possible. We want to, without being condescending, we want to help you and we want to give you access to resources to come up with the plans and projects that you want to do. Not to tell you what projects you should be doing, but to help you come up with your plan. And if they already have a plan, help them move their plan along. They're going to be at every place in the spectrum, right? They might need help just finishing a project that they've already been trying to, like Versher has been trying to do a project for like almost 10 years. And they just need help. They've gone over so many hurdles. They just need help finishing it. And some of those people have put their blood, sweat, and tears and volunteer time into that project, and they just need help finishing. And this might be a part of that strategy. They have a big project. This wouldn't help completely solve that, but it might be able to help them move it along and help them finish that project with like engineering, architecture services, project management services to reduce the amount that is hitting that town of 670 people, I think it was. So it's an excellent, excellent point. I do think there's a long-term conversation.
The next couple slides were to be like, don't just take our word for it. Like I said, we've been trying to track where money is being awarded to illustrate the data. So Doug, I don't know if you want to, I can continue to walk through some of this that we've put together, and we don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time here. We can talk more about the mechanics of the 3 million, but thought it would be good to give you guys kind of a view of what we're talking about when we say that we're seeing a lot of money. I'm going to just go into Chittenden County with 52 projects and then less money in, let's say, Grand Isle with 3 projects. The other thing I want to say, though, too, is to myself, it's not necessarily just about the amount of money. There's impact. It doesn't necessarily need to be super expensive. Different towns could have smaller projects that are just as impactful and just as transformative as a larger project somewhere else. So I do want to just recognize that. But again, the fact that we're seeing less applications come through is still an issue that we want to try to do kind of a short-term remediation of. So this is a kind of a simple view. Doug, I don't know if there's anything you want to say here, or if people have questions, I can keep scrolling through some of the other visual representations.
So this data started to crystallize in our first annual report last July. And the report was due last July. It took us several months to package and analyze the data. And that's why we started developing this and started keeping a closer eye on this in the fall. I'm a data person. I'm not a big fan of a hard sell. I've worked with the legislature for a lot of years, and I prefer to put facts on the table and then let the policymakers reach decisions. But to me, this data has crystallized over time, and it's not showing any sign of moving away from the pattern that's emerging right now, where we are seeing a heavy concentration of ARPA funds going into the densely populated and developed areas. It's somewhat predictable. But we did try to put more technical assistance out there. Like the legislature did appropriate funds to try to make sure everyone had access to resources. And I think hindsight's much easier, right? Looking at the data, seeing it emerge. The only way I believe we can bend the curve on where these projects are coming from is to provide the technical assistance to help get some of those numbers up. When we approached all of our programs, it's not that we're receiving project applications that are being denied in these other areas. It's that they're not getting the applications to deny. Generally speaking right now, if it's a qualified project, there's still funding available. It's still getting approved. And so that's where we need to generate more projects to go into the pipeline to get funding. And ARPA doesn't have to fund to completion. It can fund phases of a project to move it forward and to make some progress without having to reach that final state.
This slide has it been updated? I mean, what's the date that,
We pulled this together last week.
so this is,
This is real time. This is current.
Yeah.
and then, so when we're looking at, we're seeing the total funding to date, what is the total funding that's out there?
Yeah. So this is just the infrastructure style projects. The total funding that was dedicated to infrastructure style projects, depending on where you draw the line on certain programs and how those programs divided up, is between 600 and 700 million. So roughly a third of the infrastructure style money is obligated to specific approved projects.
And what's the
essentially.
deadline, Doug, for when it needs under ARPA?
So everything has to be obligated by 12/31/2024. So we have less than 2 years to fully obligate the funds. And then we have 2 more years to spend the money, which 4 years for a capital project is a very short timeline. And that's one reason the rural assistance is intended to give more support to accelerate projects, to help them with community engagement, to move them along faster than we traditionally see these projects move.
But the dollars aren't just for municipalities, is that correct?
Correct. There's one program immediately comes to mind, are the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. There was a program called Capital Investment Grants. There's a second iteration of that, Community Recovery and Revitalization Program, if I have the acronym right. So that is one that businesses can apply to. But we do see a whole variety of organizations and entities coming forward because, again, that's one for kind of sticks and bricks business. So we've seen a lot of like childcare facilities apply for that, for example. There may be, I don't think any municipalities can apply. You might know better than I, Chair Marcotte with what the eligibility parameters were in the last iteration, but that is mostly businesses that apply for that
Yeah.
money.
I think it was open to municipalities as well.
Is it
For-
just like farmers can apply? It's not just like the traditional business you
Right.
think of.
Yeah. Municipalities with water projects that are focused on economic development can
Yeah.
apply to the ACCD program.
Gotcha.
Edie?
So when I look at this slide, it feels like it's skewing the data. It would be really helpful to have a slide like this that had percent of population and number of towns in those, in each of these counties.
So
My guess is, yeah.
we have looked at it per capita. I don't know if you want to talk about per capita a little bit. I don't know if I brought that. Let's see if one of the ones I have lower is per capita. I don't know if we brought that by, this one's just projects again. So the short answer is we do have the data by per capita, and we did have a lot of really robust conversation around whether or not per capita was a good
Yeah.
marker. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all when we get into the index
So
piece.
in my first attempt to
If you have one
evaluate
here,
these
but-
results last fall, I took the number of projects, the total funding, and the per capita distribution, and I averaged those into like an outcome score. And one reason you don't want to just trust per capita by itself is because per capita has zero lens for equity, right? The whole purpose of the ARPA state fiscal recovery programs were to help Vermont recover. And some of our communities are farther behind in terms of development and economic activity. So when we invest in a specific area that is population dense, yes, it's going to be easier to spend, it's easy to go to Burlington and spend $20 million, right? That's the main reason we incorporated per capita, but we didn't rely solely on that.
Yeah, no, I would just like it included in this. I don't want us to rely on it. I just
Yeah.
feel like without it, this information is missing. It's missing.
We can send that. We have that. And like Doug was saying,
And number of towns, I think, is helpful too.
Well, I think going beyond the number of towns is the names of the towns.
Yeah.
I think for us, the communities that we represent,
right.
we can actually, we can look and see which towns are getting the money, and I think we should all know pretty well which towns have the wherewithal to go about getting it.
Did you bring so one of the things we talked about bringing today, I don't know if Doug brought it or not, we can send it in, was we have an Excel sheet of all the projects by address. So
Right.
and that's all public information. So we can share that. And like I said, when I started out, I acknowledged the county level was kind of a simplistic way to look at it in some counties, right? Not have towns that are very different, right? So, but just for representative today, this was the easiest way to show it to you. But we can provide and follow up with you after we have an Excel that has all the projects that have been funded on it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, there's actually good, because I had a question earlier and this makes even more sense. When you're, Doug, when you were saying like you're gonna go, AOA is gonna like go on the ground and help the towns and things like that, and thinking about like the like even with when you guys came yesterday and we're speaking to a bunch of like northern Upper Valley towns. So many of them like don't realize that they have a relationship with RPCs and RDCs and all this stuff. So it's awesome that you're gonna like go in and rally them and stuff like that. But are you also going to like bring in and make sure that the long-term relationships and also the long-term relationships when the chair was talking about the individual towns, like is there also going to be an effort to strengthen the relationship with like the reps, like, basically using the resources to make sure that the towns realize they have the infrastructure already in place, just not using it and like reinforcing that there's a structure there. And yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the most important phases in Vermont of any successful project is the community engagement process. And that's generally what can take a lot of time. What people don't necessarily know how to approach that, even with the best of intentions, they don't necessarily know all the steps to pull together good community engagement, which includes the local reps, which includes the RPCs. So in that project scoping process, community engagement would be a primary element of that.
So why don't we jump into like how this works? Like what will the 3 million do? How will communities access it? Because I feel like a lot of the questions are starting, I could be wrong, but to like dive into that direction. Doug, if you want to talk about that piece, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen if that's okay with folks, and I'll get this to Andrew to put on your, I'm sorry, finishing up this morning, get on your committee page, and we'll follow up with you, well, with everybody on the list of projects that we funded that have addresses and the per capita, and then you can also play with it and see what you think.
Right. So the $3 million would provide services to the qualified municipalities. And those services would fall anywhere in the project planning, scoping, project implementation spectrum. Now, everyone talks about it slightly differently. Everyone has a different term for, a phase. We tried to craft them so that they would be more catch-all language. Basically, if it's a qualified project, wherever you are in that process, we want to help. Many of our programs, like at A&R or at VTrans, you have to be at a certain stage to even engage with that project, with that program, right? A&R needs you to have a book ready and present to them of that project before they'll really consider funding it. And so many of the smaller towns are probably going to need needs assessments, opportunity assessments to look at what federal programs are available right now or coming up. And then, of course, the community engagement, that kind of, that building the support for the project and making sure that is truly what the community wants to do. If you have a select board that wants to do something, but no one in the town likes it, that needs to be brought to the front quickly to avoid wasting everyone's time and money. And the state wouldn't be telling towns what they have to do. We would be, posting the available services and maybe generic advice on how to approach it, where you should start. But I do think it's important that we would offer these services by setting up retainer agreements. Now, in many places, the RPCs are probably going to be the only ones that respond to that retainer agreement, and that's fine. We've been talking with the RPCs about this. We are happy to work with that. And that does link up with those long-term relationships and long-term channels. But what it does is it provides the RPCs with a retainer agreement to provide specific service to specific towns that they can then bill AOA for. So it creates data as well, which is nice, of which towns are utilizing those services and for what. So when we get to next year with the legislature, AOA would be able to report back, these are the exact services that were accessed in these areas. So it would help us highlight the gap. And honestly, if no one came forward and it was underutilized, that would tell us a lot as well. From visiting all these counties, we really don't think it will be underutilized. It will be more enough of, this is how we've committed the $3 million and this is how we've spent it. So because some of those services are short-term, like a needs assessment is upfront work, pre-planning work, but project implementation and management or engineering services through the life of a project can take 3 or 4 years. We would scope out what services a town needs and then commit those funds to that town. And that would help us move through the $3 million. Now, anyone have any questions about what services we are providing or the mechanism we're using? I would say one more thing to add is that we would set up those retainer agreements, but then we would leave the door open for towns to approach us. If they're large enough that it makes sense for them to hire a professional to work in their office, we might be able to support that on a short-term basis as well to help them deal with the expense of pulling on that new staff. So we want to leave the door open for direct grants to municipalities if the situation makes sense. If it's a town of 500 and they want to hire a full-time economic development professional, I don't know that that's the best investment. So we would want to just look at the facts and talk through it with them. But if 3 or 4 small towns are like, we want to go in together on an economic development professional, and because they would rather have that resource under, direct access to that resource and under their control, that's definitely something that's worth talking about. Sharing resources is a path we need to explore for a lot of our smaller communities.
So if a small community had a project and, the select board, and hopefully we're touching base with the planning commissions in those towns as well. But the community really doesn't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. So, the NRC has come into a lot of communities and done that work of engaging the community and get the community out there and explaining what's going on. And so would you vision this as the ability to bring the NRC in as well as part of the grant, part of that whole program to get the community to understand what's happening and why the select board and planning commissions may want to go forward with the project?
I think it's very likely that when we publish the RFP for these high-level retainer agreements, most of the respondents will be RPCs, VNRC, will be active players, our current players. And that's one reason this isn't a new program. We're just trying to facilitate more targeted funding to certain activities for certain towns to help them take advantage of the state programs that already exist. And we want to do that general RFP just to see if we can get more resources from the business sector involved in the process. You know, if we do a state level RFP, they might respond where they might not respond to a smaller town or an RPC issuing. So it might pull more people into the system, and that's, I think, a question worth answering.
I guess one thing that I struggle with, and I think Monique said it, you know, she had her communities yesterday where you all went down, is that you have small communities that don't even know who or what an RPC is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
but I kind of struggle with that, that answer that, so I want to think we'll want to make sure that our RPCs are hearing that.
Yep.
That they need to be very relevant in the communities that they serve, all of their communities, not just
Right.
bigger ones, so.
And it goes back what Rep. Jerome was asking about earlier. So we'll set up these, AOA would set up these retainer agreements. So again, to be clear, like Doug will not be the person that's providing assistance to Newport or to
Right.
Brandon or to Bradford. But if Newport, Brandon, or Bradford were like, oh, we'll get to a priority list in a second, but just bear with me. We want to engage on this. What we would do is we'd have Doug, we'd have the LCT, we'd have the RPCs, maybe the RDCs. I know I'm doing a lot of alphabet soup here. If anyone doesn't know what an RPC or an RDC is, just stop, or AOA, and let us know, and we'll stop using acronyms. VLCT, to go directly to these communities and say, congratulations. There are, again, bear with me for this example, there are 7 organizations on retainer that are available to you that could help you with different infrastructure projects that your community might be interested in pursuing. Here's the list of the 7 organizations. I'm making this up. It's your RPC, it's Kendall Smith LLC, it's Ready, it's VNRC, it's enter your favorite organization here. And so if you need help with community visioning, with filling out a grant application, with figuring out which state programs you might qualify for, with active project management, look at this list of 7 people, choose who you want to work with, and then that enter into an agreement, a contract, right, with these 7 people, then, or sorry, not all 7, with one of these people. So I choose Kendall Smith LLC, and I'm the town of Bradford. Then Kendall Smith LLC will bill Doug AOA directly for any services rendered in terms of helping Bradford, whether you were working with them for grant writing or community organizing or active project management. I would bill AOA directly at a set rate cap. We'd work schedule, like how that reimbursement process works. And then to make sure Bradford or Newport or Brandon know, like, again, hey, you have these resources. There's these 7 people that are on retainer that can work with you for these services. That's where we're talking about, like, somehow requiring a set list of entities to, like, literally door knock on a certain set list of communities' proverbial doors, and kind of check the box, like, hey, did you know this is available to you? This is what it is. And if that community says, no, we know, thank you, and we're not interested, then we check the box. We've done what we can. We've told them that the resources are there. We've told them how they can access it. They're going to take a pass for whatever reason. But again, like Doug was saying, the reception we've been getting to this when we've been going around the state, so far we've been down in Bennington, Rutland, Essex, Orleans, Orange. We're going to Windham County at the beginning of February, has been overwhelming from the people that have attended these larger interagency conversations of, like, this would be so helpful. Like, we need this type of capacity, this type of human capacity to be able to access these funds. And we want to access these funds, and we have ideas. We just don't have the time. And so anyway, that just to kind of put, like, a more illustrative point on what we're proposing. But then we should get into, and I see Rep. Williams, the DEX, which is the part that is everyone's favorite, or not.
I have a quick
Anika, John, and then.
Yep.
Yeah, and Chair Marquette, when you mentioned planning commissions, and I'm just thinking like, so often communication comes from, say, like VLCT or the state, and it goes just to like the town clerk's office. And Rep. Jerome was making a point earlier about sometimes just have like a part-time clerk, and that information doesn't actually get to the planning commissions, conservation commissions, Parks and Rec, anything like that. So I'm curious, like, if you're gonna take all this time and resources to like make a concerted effort to like get these towns to pay attention and like use the resources, is that gonna include kind of rallying the siloed commissions and things like that that often are left out of the conversation because they don't get the information from the town?
Thank you for putting that point on it. It can.
Yeah, I do
We
think
can.
information sharing is
Yeah.
extremely important here. I know working with Katie Buckley, she helped us get in touch with a lot of communities, and sometimes it took her a dozen tries to actually get through. And she's very tenacious, and, she, made those communities talk to her and then explained what the opportunity was. And some people were saying no and turning down the federal funds. And she turned them around, gave them enough information for them to change their minds. So we know we're going to have to be tenacious. I think it's worth it because I think it's not an exaggeration to say this is the largest infusement of federal funds in Vermont since the New Deal. And if we don't tweak our mechanisms, things will continue and the inequities that are built into our current system will just become larger. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to patch it in the short term, but I do think it needs full legislative discussion and a longer term discussion. It's not something the administration can just come forward with a long-term proposal for fixing. There's a lot of moving parts.
I'm curious, I'm pretty tapped into the grant writing sector in Vermont. Have you done an assessment or an analysis of the number of available grant writers or floating administrators out there? Because if everybody is seeking this technical assistance at once, I'd imagine there would be some challenges there.
Yeah, and that's one reason I want to leave this open to the private industry. And maybe the RPCs set up master contracts and then we sub through them. But grant writing and remote project management is like a cottage industry right now. There's a lot of professional growth in that area. It's happening inside and outside of Vermont. So part of the challenge with this whole effort would also be, in some cases, if we can get the town resources, but they're not resources that show up every day, they're resources that help them over the internet, that also may be something we need to take a little bit more time to help them get comfortable with. Remote resources are not, and some towns don't have the internet connection yet to really interface very well with those remote resources. So yes, there is going to be a legitimate challenge getting the right resources to the right places. And I think it's something that the RPCs, have a lot of background managing, and the additional retainer contract might help them acquire some more subs, and then they can, some of the larger communities might be just fine working with a remote grant writer. And so they shift resources internally. Now, I'm talking a little bit too much for them there, but that's just hypothetically how it could work. But yeah, you're right. There is a tight market if we only look at in-person in Vermont resources. And for some of those, we might need to try to pull, and sometimes it works and we actually pull people into the state, which is always a good thing.
Thank you. I'm Representative Mulvasiak, and I represent Burlington, just for the record here. So we also have trouble spending money too, just for the record, and having enough capacity, which seems to be the theme of this entire proposal as well as going forward. And I'm sorry if you mentioned this in the front end when I had another meeting I had to attend. But in terms of capacity, I mean, this is the front end of getting more federal funding for these smaller towns in theory. But there's a back end. There's always reporting and compliance and other things that are going to go well into this after this fiscal year is over. And so I struggle to understand how we're going to continue to support those towns when they already have capacity issues now, 2 to 3 years from now, when they have to be, at the end of their projects, when they've spent down the money, doing the grant reports, et cetera, when they are barely able to, access and put the grant proposals in now. So I'm just wondering, I appreciate your point about there's a bigger policy conversation here around the system of support for these small towns, the roles of RPCs, RDTCs, and all that. But for now, this feels like a big infusion of money to get even more grants, which is great. But what about the back end, 2 to 3 years from now?
Right, so the 4 and 5 items on the services provided, those are those longer term services. So the $3 million would likely all be committed within a year. That's the goal, is to commit them in a very short time frame because there's urgency here. But they would be committed to certain communities depending on what they need. If they need those trailing services, then we would commit for 3 or 4 years of trailing services so that they can actually take on that project. In many cases, you're absolutely correct. They wouldn't do a project because they know they don't have the capacity to perform those activities for 4 years. So it wouldn't be all expended within the first year. It would be committed and lined up to those various services, whether they just need help getting started or whether they need those trailing supports. And I think that's one reason we used we created the index, the Underserved Community Index, based on Treasury guidance. And that Treasury guidance focuses on, let me find the exact Treasury definition. Geographic communities that have been systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life. And so I'm not going to go into the weeds of the index right now, but generally speaking, we created a needs side, which has indicators on it related to income, labor force participation, the changes in a town's grand list over time, and really tries to get a feel for what are the needs within that community? How many vulnerable Vermonters are within that particular community? And then we created a capacity side of the index. And we are currently, we received a lot of feedback on the capacity side in particularly since there is a lack of data for small towns in Vermont. So many of the things that would be great to measure, like how many full-time staff do you have in your town? There is no data set for that. So many of the things that would be nice to make decisions based off of, we simply do not have the data to make those decisions. But we're moving towards, right now, we're considering a couple variables that were proposed by VLCT, that have been proposed by various legislators. And really, we want to just make sure the intent is to capture what is the capacity of this community to respond to grant opportunities. So we're looking at population, of course, we're looking at their total budget. We collected every municipality's total budget in the federal certification process for the local fiscal recovery funds. That's actually the only time we've actually had a full set of municipal budgets at the state. So it's a unique data set. And then the other factor we're looking at is, what is your municipal grand list? Because as most people know, the municipal grand list is the primary tax base the municipalities can use. And then they make choices about what tax rates they set. That's local control, right? But that municipal grand list speaks to a capacity for taxation and a capacity to raise funds. If you have a community that only has residential properties and they have no larger commercial properties, they're likely to have a very thin tax base. They're likely to have a lot of problems raising and paying for their infrastructure. And so a town with the exact same number of people with a different grand list can have a much different capacity. So those are the 3 variables that we're looking at right now for evaluating capacity. And then we average those 2, the capacity and the need, treating them equally, and we rank them on the index. The proposal is to offer this assistance to the top 25%. That's also because for towns that need multiple years of services, $3 million is a lot of money. I'm from Marshfield, Vermont. I grew up in the woods, so $3 million is a lot of money. But to commit to multiple years of grant writing and project management services, that could, if a town has a viable project that we want to commit to 4 years of services for, that's going to take a bite out of that $3 million very quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering you're talking about the timeline and the expenditure. You're talking about using this money over the course of a year, but we're talking about the BAA, so this money really is just through June. I mean, the budget is through June. We're talking about $3 million that we need, that you think is necessary before July 1st, in theory.
Emergency spending like this that we allocate in the BAA, leftover funds would generally roll over and carry forward to the next fiscal year. The reason we need to start it now versus putting it in next year's budget is that every day basically that goes by, there's less chance that one of these towns will be able to get in the door because there's less than 2 years left to obligate those funds. So if we get it, if this passes in the BAA, we're already working on an RFP so that we can immediately start setting up the mechanism for the towns to access these services. And the goal is to have the retainer agreements in place and towns accessing those services within 60 days of passage. So that would still be before the budget even passes. So I think it depends on the nature of the program for the BAA, whether you're shoring up a gap that was identified or providing supplemental funding. But I think in this case, the primary reason we're putting it in the BAA is because of the timing and the urgency.
The language in the BAA would allow, like, you could write the language and the language would say like the money is, everyone is like good for, in that terms of like AOA, you'd still be able to, AOA would have the funds and the funds would just be spent until they are gone, like however long that takes. They wouldn't have to be spent by July 1st. But again, we think there might be a good chance that a good portion of them are encumbered by July 1st if we have a timely BAA passage, and like Doug just shared how the 60 days time frame to get going here. They wouldn't be clawed back, I guess is what I'm getting at. We could figure out the technical language so that happens.
Just a quick comment. Why not just look at towns that have not received any ARPA funding to date?
Like any, not through the direct ARPA allocation towns got, but you mean that got.
Haven't applied to any grants at all, like that, you know, and then I'm also concerned about small towns with lakefront property but have small populations. I'm thinking about Sudbury, a town I used to represent that has lakefront property, 500 people, part-time administrator, not a wealthy town. And I'm wondering, I just want to make sure that those kind of, and I think there's a lot of those kind of towns in Vermont, that they are not at the bottom of the list where they perhaps should be. But just a comment.
Noted.
Yeah. Right. I think that's why the grand list value would only be one of the indicators. So it would balance out, particularly if they have a small budget as a small population. The fact that their grand list is a certain amount wouldn't push them too far down the list.
Edie, and I'll give the last question for.
So it sounds like you have your list of towns already because you have your criteria and you have the data.
Yes, we published a version right now, I think.
But it's being modified. So yes, there's a list of, it's 246.
Yes, the census defines it as 246.
246 in terms of that ranking that Doug alluded to. And what we were suggesting is if you score 75% as a cutoff or above, and that was where we chose to kind of draw the line, but we're working on modifying this and having a very active conversation with a lot of legislators who are leaning in, which is exciting. Like the fact that people are like, I want my town to be on the list is exciting, and the debate that I would want to be having, and not just, we shouldn't do it. Like, how can we modify that priority list in a way that it hits the right spot where we're targeting those communities that need the extra assistance. And so anyway, it's 61. If you draw that line, I think it's about 61 communities fall at 75% or above currently. But like I said, based on a lot of feedback, we're working with VLCT and a company called Guidehouse as well on how to modify it. Like one of the things that was throwing people off at the beginning was there was a ranking for if you had a higher education institute. And then like kind of the radius and around that as a marker, that kind of threw things a little bit. We're working with VLCT on municipal staff capacity pieces. So again, I think actually Doug may have sent the list. You can see the list as it currently stands, but it's being modified to again account or kind of play with that higher ed shadow. For example, like Plainfield is scoring under 75%. I'm not guaranteeing they'll be above 75%. They have Goddard, but if you drive through Plainfield, it's not exactly, I actually have family from Plainfield, so I love Plainfield, but it could use some of that assistance, I think, to access some of these funds potentially. So anyway, we're playing with some of the factors, but you can look through it when you have time as it currently stands.
Well, there could be some language that could be inserted also to allow the secretary some decisions, even if they fall below the 75%. If there are, extraordinary
Yes.
circumstances.
Exactly,
That would factor into that.
exactly.
Should get it,
So we could set the target and then allow for that flexibility if a town wants to appeal, and then we could, yes.
So we have to go to the floor. Are you available to come back at 1 o'clock?
I can be, I can,
I
Are
am in the
you?
Senate at 1.
Doug is testifying in the Senate at 1. I would like to have Doug here because he has a little bit more of the technical expertise. How long do you think you'll be in the Senate, Doug?
I'm booked for 1 to 2 right now.
Could you do 2?
Yeah, we can move some things around. We've got some people that are scheduled for 2 if they want, but we can let the others know that we'll push them down. So do we know who drafted the language in here?
I did.
But you didn't put it into convention, so,
What do you mean, sorry?
well, it's.
In the BAA language?
Yeah,
Yes.
so it's drafted in, one of our drafters must have drafted it?
No,
No?
the language that's in BAA, I drafted. And I am not a lawyer. Full disclosure. So,
Okay.
but you thought Ledge Council drafted it?
Well, I'm just wondering if somebody,
And then-
somewhat,
then I will- Excellent.
if you have any
Bye.
following
I see that.